All right, good morning. It's a treat to share with you Psalm 48, which is a psalm that I know pretty well, almost by heart. I think of it as Moach. Moach means mind, which equals 48. And I think of it as Moach because it's the psalm for Monday. And as I've tried to memorize which psalm is the psalm for each day, I've made this mental calculation that on Monday I need to engage my mind. And so hence Psalm 48. But I never looked carefully at Psalm 48 to ask, why did the rabbis choose this in the Talmud as Psalm for Monday in the Mishnah in Tamid 7:4? And the explanation is that this is a psalm that both asserts God's control over creation, which, as we saw from Sunday, is Psalm 24. That one we've looked at together. Continuation, that's God as creator. This is God in control. But there's another dimension, and that there's tension here. Monday, the second day, is the only day of the creation in which God does not say it was good. God does not say kitov, which is why the tradition is you don't get married on a Sunday night or Monday, traditionally, because it's the one day God didn't bless as good. That's the day in which God separated the waters from below and the heavens above, water to water, blue to blue. And the rabbis say in that regard, there was no real distinction making as on the other days. And in that regard, it was kind of a forced separation because there was a machloket, because there was a tension between the waters. And so Monday in some is a day of tension for the rabbis, and Psalm 48 has this quality of, you'll see, some tension, but when you read it, it's not tension that comes to the foreground. What comes to the foreground is an ode to Jerusalem, if you will, a love song to Jerusalem. So I can't help but start our sharing today with Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, because that's a contemporary love song about Jerusalem. And it's a place that my heart goes because it gives context to how this psalm reflects something ancient in Jewish identity and mindset. So, Eric, you got to make me the co-host so I can share. And I'm going to do two things. I'm going to share a shortened version of Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, this one put out by the Jewish National Fund, with an English translation so we can appreciate the words. You get some images here of Jerusalem, its citadels, which will be reflected in the psalm. The psalm will invite the pilgrim to walk the walls of Jerusalem.
As cool as wine, the wind is sighing through silent mountain paths. The evening light is slowly dying as bells of evening chime. So many songs, so many stories, the rocks and hills recall. Within your heart, inside the city, the ancient stones, the wall. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, forever young, forever old. My heart will
So that's just a place for us to kind of be reminded of how Jerusalem touches the heart traditionally. That was a song composed by one of Israel's great songwriters, Naomi Shemer, and she wrote it before the 60. Whoops, 1 second. I got to go back and stop the whatever comes up next. Uh-oh. 1 second. Another version, but let me stop it. All right, as pretty as that is, we'll stop. That song was composed in 67 for an annual festival of Jerusalem songs, composed when Israel was when Jerusalem was controlled by Jordan from 48 to 67. And Naomi Shemer, who was larger than life in the Israeli song community, composed that as a theme song, not as a competitor for that year's competition. And people heard this song, and then when the 67 war took place and Israel regained control over the ancient walled part of the city, she recrafted one of the verses and it became the theme song for that 6-day war victory and for the unification of Israel with the sacred city, of the old city of Jerusalem. Here's another share screen to get today going, and that's a map called the Bunting map. And this is a Christian map by Heinrich Bunting of Hanover in the Holy Roman Empire, 1581. Here, note that Jerusalem is at the center of the world. Now, some historians say that this was not uncommon in the Middle Ages to put Jerusalem at the center of cartography. That, historians say, began after the 13th century when the Crusades took Israel, that maps began to put Israel at the center, and in this form, there was both a sense of Trinity, a sense of a cross, and a sense of the city of Jerusalem and the temple as the navel or the heart of the world. I anticipate that it's not only because, again, this is 1581, there's a little America here on the side, America had been discovered, but emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, where the Bible was at the center of identity, spirituality, Jerusalem for the Christian community was also at the center and actually believed to be, if you will, physically at the center with an opening on the side. And for Islam, with Al-Aqsa Mosque, also in the future, Israel would be a center of the world too. But that notion of Israel at the center goes back to the earliest layers. Interestingly, the word Zion, like Zionism, the word Zion in Hebrew, which will appear in Psalm 48, is a Jebusite term. When Joshua went to conquer the land, he did not succeed, according to the book of Joshua 15, verse 63, in conquering Jerusalem. It was controlled by this tribe, the Jebusites. Jerusalem is high, but not that high relatively. It's 2,500 feet elevation, but it's elevated on 3 sides. Whenever Jerusalem has been conquered, it's only from the north. And so when Joshua went to conquer Jerusalem, he failed. King David would be the one to conquer Jerusalem from the Jebusites, who called it Zion. It's not clear what the word Zion means. Contemporary scholars say it might mean dry place or rugged. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 7 to 9, there's the description of David conquering Zion, and it's called a great feat because it was a natural fortress at the center of the crossroads, coming from either, to the ocean and Nod or going across the land. Jerusalem was a natural fortress and a center. It would become the capital of David, Ir HaDavid. And he would make it not only the political center, but the religious center, where the temple would be built by his son Solomon, but with David anticipating that. And for the rest of Jewish history, Jerusalem would be at the heart of Jewish identity. Listen to one more little reading, and I got to pace myself because there's so much to share. But listen to the book of Lamentations, the book of Echa, which describes the destruction of the first temple, 586, by the Babylonians. Alas, Echa, lonely sits the city, once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. The princess among states is becoming a thrall. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her. Of all her friends, all her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. And so as the book of Lamentations begins, Jerusalem is in tears, which is to say, that's a poetic expression, but more. Jerusalem is given human-like qualities, the lover of the people, the mother of the people, endowed by God as a holy city. And one more pause. In the creation story, the only thing called holy is time, namely Shabbat, Vayikadesh Oto. God sanctified it, Shabbat. There is no holy thing in the 7 days of creation. The only thing that reflects God's image is the human being. B'Tselem Elohim bara oto. In the image of God, Adam was created. It's only later that Jerusalem as place will be identified as holy, which is the motif throughout the ancient world. We'll see, for instance, the word Saphon, and I'll unpack a few words, which is in the mountain of Baal among the Canaanites, Saphon, meaning in Canaanite religion and in the religion of Sumeria of the ancient Near East, which is why ziggurats were built. God was where heaven and earth met, which is the mountaintops. And Zion, Har Zion, is a mountain, Mount Zion. And in that regard, the motif of the holy mountain is picked up, will persist, and will be a longing for the Jewish people in this, I use the word miracle, a people for 2,000 years separated from a place, longing and returning. So now Psalm 48, a pilgrim's psalm. I'll read it and then share some of the artistry of the psalm, some of the difficult choices in translation. It delights me, Ahuva, to see you back. I always feel when you're in our presence, Ahuva, it brings Bible scholarship to a more serious level. For me, I'm accountable. So I entitled Psalm 48, City of Our God, in that it's a phrase that appears twice in this psalm and is somewhat a bracket, meaning this phrase, City of Our God, will appear in verse 2 and verse 9, after which there is Selah. This psalm is divided into 3 parts. Verses 1 to 9 describe Jerusalem, and it does so from the perspective of both an Israelite, but also from the perspective of a foreign king. And I'll return to who these foreign kings are. And then structurally, the opening verse 2 will use the word Eloheinu, our God, which will come back in the closing verse. You'll have Elohim Eloheinu, God, our God. That's somewhat the frame. The second half of the psalm, beginning verse 10, is a description of God. And I'm just going to point this out because it's too important and I have so much, I don't want to overlook it. God, who is the guardian of Jerusalem, which we saw in Psalm 46, 47, and 48 are often linked. But here too, God, the focus of God is not God's power of armies, but rather verses 10, 11, and 12, God's kindness in verse 10, God's righteousness in God 11, God's justice in verse 12. So that the God of Psalms, the God of the Bible, is to be extolled as a mighty God of war, but ultimately and at the core of why we honor God is because of God's attributes. So one more reading from Scripture before I read the Psalm. Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 23. But only in this should one glory, in his earnest devotion to me. God is speaking. For I, the Lord, act with kindness, chesed, mishpat, justice, utzdaka, righteousness, ba'aretz, in the land, ki ve'ele chafatzti, for in these I delight, ne'um Adonai. So says God. You get this elsewhere, like in Hosea 2:21. We saw it in Psalm 33, verse 5, meaning here as the psalm grows, God is portrayed in 10, 11, and 12 by attributes of justice, kindness, righteousness. And then the last part, 13 to 15, are an invitation to the pilgrim. Go around Zion and circle her, count her towers, mark your hearts to her rampart, climb up her palaces, so that you may recount it unto the final generation. And the closing verse, for this is God, our God, forever and ever. God will guide us past death. Those last two words, which I translate as will guide us past death, with a semblance of the world to come, those last two words I'll share at the end have at least 5 different translations, which is the power of poetry, namely ambiguity. All right, with that as an overview of structure, let me read. A song, a psalm of the sons of Korach. Great is Adonai and highly to be praised in the city of our God, God's holy mountain, beautiful scenery. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, expanses of Tziphon, of the town of the mighty ruler. God in her palaces is famed as a haven. For behold, the rulers were assembled. They passed by together. They saw such that they were amazed. They were terrified. They rushed away. Trembling seized them there, pangs like a woman in labor, as when an east wind smashes the ships of Tarshish. As we have heard, so we have seen in the city of Adonai of hosts, in the city of our God. May God establish it forever. Selah. We have witnessed, God, your kindness in the midst of your sanctuary. Like your name, God, so is your praise to the ends of the earth. Righteousness fills your right hand. Let Mount Zion be happy. Let there be rejoicing for the daughters of Judah because of your judgments. Go around Zion and encircle her. Count her towers. Mark your hearts to her rampart. Climb up her palaces so that you may recount it unto the final generation. For this is God, our God, forever and ever. God will guide us past death. Now, some of the choices, just to highlight the artistry of the Psalter. I like the images of chiasma, only because I'm kind of somewhat new to poetry. I never took a college class in poetry, though as a freshman English student in college, I heard my first poet speak. And the poet said, in response to a question about interpretation, the poet said, "It doesn't matter what I intended when I wrote my poem. The only thing that matters is how you experience the words before you." Which is to say, and I'm going to point out now, first I'm going to point out a chiasma, a structural motif. Let me do that, and then I'll point out how there are certain words here that are only used for the first time in this psalm. And I'll show you an interesting one. But first, the chiasma. The first 2a and 4 deal with God. So it's like a bracket. 2a and 4 is God, and 2b and 3 deal with describing Mount Zion or Jerusalem. It's as if God is holding Jerusalem. It is God's city, embraced by God. Now, here you see it is called a holy mountain in verse 2, the city of our God. In that regard, our God, the psalmist, is speaking to the community. This, unlike most psalms, is not to God. In that regard, it's primarily to a national psalm, speaking about our God, God's holy mountain. The word Noph in verse 3, I translate as scenery. Noph is a common word in modern Hebrew for scenery, but this is the only place it occurs in the whole of Hebrew scripture, Tanakh, as a noun. So again, for a modern Hebrew speaker, it's obvious that Noph means scenery, but in the Bible, not necessarily so. The word Noph is a word that can mean for the early rabbis the tip of a tree. So for the Tanaim, it's the top of a tree. And in Arabic, interestingly, which is related to Hebrew, they both come out of the same Proto-Semitic roots, it does mean a top of a mountain, could be a Noph. But maybe because one is standing on top of a mountain and taking in the view, the word Noph will become a noun in modern Hebrew for scenery. And because I have a love of Jerusalem and its scenery, in this regard, the choice of a modern translation. Mount Zion, expanses of Tzifon. Tzifon can be understood as north in modern Hebrew, but Tzifon means in the north. But as used elsewhere in Tanakh, Tzifon is simply a holy mountain. It was the place where Baal, the Canaanite god, had his residence. And so here, Tzifon is like Mount Olympus in Greek mythology, the place of the gods, expanses of Tzifon. And here's an interesting tension. Kiryah, in contrast to Ir, which will be used regularly in this psalm, is a town. Town has a more intimate feeling than Ir, city, the town of Melech Rav, the mighty ruler. So on one hand, God is described as Melech Rav, the mighty ruler, and yet has a residence in a town town, that's our town, the town of Jerusalem. So a description of these rulers who are assembled, and no adu, the Hebrew word for assembled, can also be a wordplay. No adu can mean famed, so they are famous. It can also mean conspired, coming together, which it's also assembled. And so they gathered together, but then they were terrified and they rushed away. And then this poetic image, verses 7 and 8, it's like a woman in birth pangs, or the wind smashing the ships of Tarshish. Not clear where Tarshish is. It's a word that does appear elsewhere in the Bible, like Jonah is on the way to Tarshish. Ezekiel will describe the mighty naval ships of Tarshish. So the ships of Tarshish are identified with power that gets smashed. It's not clear for this entire psalm what is the event. We did look earlier in describing Sennacherib's Sennacherib encircling Jerusalem in the year 701. Sennacherib in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19, Isaiah 36 and 37, 185,000 troops. This son of Sarna, of Sargon, his father Sargon had been a great conqueror, and his son Sennacherib was conquering the towns throughout the empire. And it's not clear in the biblical account why in the morning the troops were vanquished or fled. Was it a plague? Was it a curse by God? It's not clear if that is the event being described here. It's the most common medieval classic Jewish commentary. The first commentator to make this claim was in the 4th century, Theodore of Mopsuestia, but it got picked up on. It's not clear whether it's foreshadowing the future. So Rashi and Radak in the Middle Ages say it's the battle yet to occur of Gog and Magog, that this is not about the past, this is the forecast of the messianic future in which those kings will be defeated. But defeated they are. Again, the historical prompt is not clear, and there is celebration in verse 9. Adonai of hosts. And again, hosts means armies. In modern Hebrew, tzava is an army. May God establish it forever. The sense of God being eternal. And now again, that description of God, verses 10 through 12, beyond God's might as warrior is God's justice, kindness, righteousness. Let Mount Zion be happy, for that is the nature of its king. Verses 13 to 15, an invitation for pilgrims. And this is the psalm widely read even now when a person goes to Jerusalem as an invitation of pilgrims to see the walls that have survived thousands of years, the Jerusalem for whom yearning has persisted and who has been reclaimed. And so now just the last 2 words, as I am now at my finish time. For this is God our God forever and ever. Last phrase, God will guide us. Al Mut. Rashi understands that last as Alamut. May God guide us like children. We've seen this phrase, Almut, in Psalms as an inscription at the beginning of Psalms of some kind of musical instrument, Psalm 9 and Psalm 46. And so Richard Levy, a contemporary translator, will say, instead of the inscription, we'll put this at the very end. May God lead us, Almut, as if on a musical instrument. The Jerusalem Talmud, Megillah 2:4, says this is olamot. If you put the two words together, in this world and the next. May God guide us in this world and the next. Radak says ad mavet, because again, you can punctuate al mavet, until death. But already in the early Middle Ages, the Midrash is Tanhuma, Bamidbar 17. Al-Mut means above death or past death, which is to say, to sum up, for this is God, our God, forever and ever. God will guide us past death, past the various battles of this life into a peaceful place of eternity. And that would then provide a segue to the psalm we're going to look at tomorrow of Korach, which will be the one psalm in which there will be this phrase of how the righteous will rule over the sinners in the world to come. And so that's for tomorrow. This is for today. Let me now have some of your reactions as I look to close the psalm and see you. It's so happy making for me to see 24 screens. Any reactions to City of Our God, the psalm for Monday, Psalm Lamed Chet, Mem Chet, Moach, the mind, a pilgrim psalm. Any questions or reactions?
Well, if I may, I'll just very quickly, this
ahead,
last
Richard.
verse, if I
Yeah.
may, God will guide us past death. And that's a phrase that is almost new to me.
Yeah.
I've read through this before, but nevertheless, that hasn't popped out quite in that same way. And I very much appreciate it. There's a sweetness to that idea that touches my heart.
Oh, thank you, Richard. I am touched by your heart being touched. And again, I marvel in these close readings of Psalms that I haven't done until, our time together, of the possibilities, as all great poetry, of many worthy interpretations. So Rashi, seeing this as God will guide us like children, that's touching in a certain way, but to guide us beyond death, which is seeing it as two words, not one, is also there, and not uncommon in some of the more contemporary translations. You prompt me to share. This is Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi's translation for Psalms. He doesn't do all the Psalms, but he does many. Listen to, just get a little bit of a taste. The last phrase, set your hearts on her strengths, raise her mansions high, then you will tell about it to generations yet to come. This is God, our God, forever and ever. He will guide us past death. So the notion of being guided past death occurs in this particular translation. And as I say, it's rooted in a midrash that's at least 1,000 years old and is one possible way of resonating with the words. Ahuva, go ahead.
Mut was one of the Canaanite gods, and with the context of death. So you might read it as God, the power of God, God is someone who can stand against. All can be understood as against that God of the Canaanite God. And why it is appropriate is because before that we have Tzafon, and you correctly noted that Tzafon was a Canaanite god. So there is some kind of a connection.
That's lovely, Ahuva. And I will add, I have read about 8 different commentaries to prepare for today. And that's where Ahuva, as a Bible scholar, adds much to my understanding. And like she says, it makes sense as one possibility in that part of the antiquity of this psalm that would point to, for a Bible scholar, to this being an earlier psalm is references to Canaanite images, specifically like Tzaphon, which again is the mountain in the Canaanite language for Baal, for their god, which, as Ahuva says, would give context why the punchline of this psalm would be to say our God is supreme over the Canaanite God, which resonates under the surface for his audience and then later gets parsed in so many other ways because for later audiences, there is not the Canaanite context of language for these words to so resonate. With that, it's so much more to share, but 10:38, and I want to have time to say Kaddish. I want to thank everybody for participating today. A little coming attraction for tomorrow. Psalm 49 is the psalm that is traditionally recited at every Shiva minyan. And that's the minions of mourning. And you'll see it is, I smile because it's a psalm that says you can't take it with you in terms of your possessions. And it's largely a critique of the wealthy who think they have power but don't, because they too will die and they will be disowned by God for failure to have used their wealth well. So I will look to share with you this little bit longer psalm, 22 verses, I believe, and the question of why did the rabbis choose Psalm 49 of all the 150 psalms as the psalm for every night of Shiva. And we'll look at that tomorrow. It's also a song of Korach, and there's a little piece of commentary to share in that regard. Thank you all. We'll close with the sharing of the Kaddish for those who have a need to honor the memory of loved ones. Let's see, here we go. I invite you to join with me. Yitkadal,
Yitkadash, Shmei Rabbah, Yama,
Divra,
Divra, Kiruteh,
V'yamlich,
V'yamlich, Bachuteh,
V'chayechon,
V'yamechon,
V'chayed
V'chayed
Bet
Bet Israel,
Ba'agala,
Ba'agala, V'zman, Kari, V'imru.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeh Shmei Rabbah Mevarach, Ve'olam U'almei Amaya, Yitbarach, V'yishtabach, Yitbar, V'yitramam, V'yitnaseh, V'yitalev, V'yitala, Shmei Tikudasha, B'richu, Leila, Min Kol Birchata, V'shirata, Tushbirchata, Nechemata, Damiran B'yama, B'imru, Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabbah, Min Shmaya, V'chayim Aleinu, V'yakol Israel, B'imru, Amen.
Oseh
Oseh Shalom B'imruma, Hu Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu V'yakol Israel, V'yakol Yoshvei Tevel, B'imru, Amen.
Amen.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Thank you, Baruch Tiyeh. And
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're most welcome. A great joy for me. Puts wind in my sails for the day to be with you. So thanks to each of you for joining.